This morning's scripture reading will be out of Matthew 1, verses 1 through 17. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, and Judah the father of Perez, and Zerah by Tamar, and Perez the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Ram, and Ram the father of Amminadab, and Amminadab the father of Nahshon, and Nahshon the father of Salmon, and Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahab, and Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David the king. And David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah, and Solomon the father of Rehoboam, and Rehoboam the father of Abijah, and Abijah the father of Asaph, and Asaph the father of Jehoshaphat, and Jehoshaphat the father of Joram, and Joram the father of Uzziah, and Uzziah the father of Jotham, and Jotham the father of Ahaz, and Ahaz the father of Hezekiah, and Hezekiah the father of Manasseh, and Manasseh the father of Amos, and Amos the father of Josiah, and Josiah the father of Jeconiah and his brothers, at the time of the deportation to Babylon. And after the deportation to Babylon, Jeconiah was the father of Shealtiel, and Shealtiel the father of Zerubbabel, and Zerubbabel the father of Abiud, and Abiud the father of Eliakim, and Eliakim the father of Azor, and Azor the father of Zadok, and Zadok the father of Achim, and Achim the father of Eliud, and Eliud the father of Eleazar, and Eleazar the father of Mathan, and Mathan the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called Christ. So all the generations of Abraham to David were 14 generations, and from David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations, and from the deportation to Babylon to the Christ of 14 generations. This is God's word. You may be seated.
Amen. Jacob, before you go, come here. Crushed it, man. Woo. When I knew we were starting Matthew today and what we were going to talk about, I said, who is going to be the one? And Jacob, as you can tell, has broad enough shoulders to bear the load. Fantastic. This is the word of the Lord. And good morning, church. We had Vikings football yesterday, and I've been not so subtly nudged by one of the shepherds that there's Cowboys football today. So either we'll be in and out quick, or I'll have some repenting to do of my own at the invitation song in just a little while. But I'm excited to be with you and very excited for the journey that we are about to step into together. I want to make sure you guys always know how much I love you, whether you're here in person or joining us online. Today is already a celebration. We welcome our new sister, Alex. I'm so excited for her. God continues to grow the kingdom here, and that is what we're going to be talking about during this next series and study of the Gospel of Matthew. This year has been a big one here at Leander. We have been on a journey of intention and identity. If you can remember, way back in January, we started to talk about immersing ourselves in this concept of the kingdom and what the kingdom was like and what kind of people populate the kingdom and how we participate in the kingdom. And we said way back in January that Matthew was going to figure large in our discussion because it's the gospel that of all the gospels is the most concerned with the idea of the kingdom. But then we did something strange and we spent 10 weeks studying Genesis instead. And we had some work to do ahead of time. Most recently, though, we've been talking about growing together so we can go together on mission with Jesus in this kingdom. And the scripture tells us again and again that this kingdom of which we are a part is here in part already, but that it will be fully realized in the new heavens and the new earth. That Jesus, who came once already to establish this new kingdom, when he comes again, he will come to put back what was lost in the garden that we studied in Genesis. And he will come so that he can walk in the midst of his creation once again. And when he comes, he will erase all brokenness and he will usher in an eternity of God's original intent for every individual and his whole creation, and that we, as members of the kingdom, now are partners in that mission. And we, as the church, are, as it were, what some scholars call the small working model of God's new creation and his new humanity. So together, we've been chasing down and pursuing and trying to discover who we really are collectively as a congregation as well as individually. And in today's world, it's so important that we have a firm handle on who we actually are, on our identity and our purpose. It's not a secret to you all that our social climate is one of polarization, it's one of misinformation, it's one of fear and anxiety, it's one of shame and cancellation, it's of pride and arrogance and posturing and choosing sides and division, and understanding the identity of yourself and the identity of God and the identity of others is a prerequisite for kingdom living. So it's a good thing that we took all this time to build all of this context before we come in and talk about the kingdom through the lens of Matthew. If you remember, we said, look for these things: kingdom versus empire, information versus transformation, data versus discovery, identity and purpose, and discipleship. And so now we finally have come to the end of an overly long introduction and to the thing that we set out to do at the beginning of the year, and that is to look at the gospel through the lens of Matthew, the gospel of a new kind of kingdom and a new kind of king. But before we step into the text this morning, I want you to stop and consider whether you are on the outside looking in of this kingdom. Maybe you intellectually know that you are part of the kingdom, but despite your best efforts and your best efforts to be faithful or to try and to be present, there are so many spaces and times in life where you feel like you're present but not a part, where you were invited but not welcome. And this starts really, really young, doesn't it? I want you to take a second, transport yourself back to the time when you were small and impressionable and precocious and mischievous and full of wonderment, whatever defined your childhood years before you reached that age of accountability, and start to think about the moments where you were not included. And think about how they may have affected your life even now up to this point subconsciously. There are things that happen to you in elementary school or preschool that set the tone for the things you don't like and the things you love in your life right now. When I was little, we were also on the red beans and rice diet, and that meant when I showed up to lunch, I didn't get to have Lunchables. And I was excluded from the kids who got to sit there looking all fancy and cool with their little crackers and their cheese and their highly saturated with sodium processed meat parts that they would slap into a little sandwich. And I look at Lunchables now and they don't even taste good, but that's not the point. I was left out. I didn't like it. It was one of the first instances of not being part of the in crowd, so to speak. And those little situations grow into bigger situations where you want to be a part of a social group, or you want to be a part of a team, or you want to be a part of a club. And sometimes this happens even within our own families. Have you ever felt like you're the one in the family that becomes the butt of every joke? So you're part of the joke, but you're not in on the joke. Or maybe that's a relationship that you have with a friend group that you just desperately want to be a part of. I want to let you know you can be a third wheel in a non-romantic way. You can just be the third guy in a group of guys or the third girl in a group of girls. I don't really know what y'all do over there, but it's scary to me because y'all come out crying and it's different. Girls and guys are different. You're best friends if they made jokes with you that crossed the line, like you fought and you were best friends by the end of the day and they had to suspend you together and you spent the whole day playing video games together. I understand someone's told me it's not like that for girls. Like if y'all fight, y'all are like dead to each other for a long time. I don't know how that works, but it makes lasting significant impact on your life. And the sad thing is, there are people even in this room, amidst this family and this joy and the Spirit, the presence of the Spirit, that actually still feel like in some ways they're on the outside looking in. And it is the most painful realization that you could ever have when you are in a place, but you don't feel like you belong in a place. Where you are with people, but you do not feel like you are part of the people. And there are people that we encounter every single day in our lives that are experiencing this. I want you to think about that concept and your own personal experiences as we look into this new gospel of a new king and a new kingdom. The first thing that we need to know about the gospel of Matthew is that the gospel of Matthew is a gospel from a Jew, Matthew, about a Jew, Jesus, to the Jews, the people of Israel. And I want to call your memory back to how the Hebrews learned and thought and how it's a little different from how we learn and think. Do you remember in Genesis, we talked about the Western way of learning? That's actually going to snap into focus today because we're going to talk about exactly what I mean when I use a phrase like that, but how we like to do that through data and information. We love data. We love reports. We love chronological, meticulously recorded history, and we learn by consuming data and memorizing data. We take that information, we extrapolate it, and we pull it apart and we tease it apart. It's a very scientific Western approach to how we learn, but that Eastern way of thinking, that Hebrew way of thinking and learning is a little bit different. They have data too, and they memorize too, but they learn through discovery and pictures and story. So there's always something buried underneath the story. The whole point to the Eastern mind was that there's something you discover in that story that provides transformational learning more than just understanding the facts of the story. So to the Hebrew, learning was about discovery. And we purposely applied that to Genesis. And we looked for transformation, not just the information. And I'm going to ask you to take the same exact mindset as we enter this study of Matthew. Because Matthew, even though writing many hundreds of years later, is still a Jew, and he is writing to Jews. And there are several different intents or agendas that he is writing to Jewish people about this new gospel and a new king and a new kingdom. So we're going to go deep this time through. And I want to give you permission once again to ask really difficult questions. And if you don't feel comfortable asking really difficult questions, that's okay, because I feel like it's my job to help us do that anyway. We're supposed to struggle and wrestle with the text because that is what Matthew is trying to get us to do. So when we encounter something that seems a little bit challenging, that's where we're supposed to dig a little bit deeper. Because Matthew, as it were, is not just writing history like we write history. It's not just a chronological record of the ministry of Jesus, even though the Gospels together provide a really good account of that. And as far as the Gospels go, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Matthew is probably the most chronologically organized. But Matthew is doing something intentional. He is talking about and recalling specific events for specific reasons and specific ideas that he wants the reader to latch onto. And Matthew is announcing a new kind of kingdom, the kingdom of heaven, a new kind of king, King Jesus. And he's buried little treasures all along the way. We might even find a couple of Hebrew linguistic tools that we started to love a lot back in our Genesis study. Anyone know that word? We might even find some chiasms. I heard it out. Yeah, this is good. Guys, that was months ago. I'm so proud right now. I'm excited. As a Jew, writing to Jews, what better way to kick off your announcement of a new kingdom and the long-awaited king, the Messiah, than a proper Jewish genealogy? Now, some of you will remember, we talked about how genealogies were incredibly important to the Jews. And we talked about this when we studied Noah first in Genesis, but then of course, definitely in Abraham, there were some examples that we had to latch onto and dig a little bit deeper on. And we remember that the purpose of a Jewish genealogy is to prove your validity, your Jewishness, your family line, your lineage, even your status, and even your claim to a throne. And we know that the promised Messiah, the one who will come, is from the line of David. So for a Jewish audience, this opening, even all 17 beautifully rendered verses by Jacob, is the perfect introduction of a Jewish Messiah. It's the only way you're going to start this thing off. But I have the first problem that we're going to encounter as we study the Gospel of Matthew. And that's that, frankly, this is probably the worst Jewish genealogy that has ever been written. And you might say, Marcus, how do you mean? It sounded like a perfectly good genealogy. I want you to remember this as we explore this. Your genealogy is supposed to be your glory and your validation and your proof. Anyone else have a father that said your name is the most valuable thing that you have? Meaning your reputation, your that's the most valuable thing that you have. You might not have money, you might not have talent, you might not have skills, but if you have a name worthy of respect, it's the most valuable thing no one can take away from you. And Matthew's genealogy betrays that principle. As we look at the ins and outs of these 17 verses, you might find yourself saying, Matthew, baby, what are you doing? This is how we're starting the New Testament. This is how we're proclaiming the new king. This is how we're going to start to talk about the one we've been waiting for. But in order to actually understand why Matthew does what he does, why it's the worst, best Jewish genealogy of all time, we got to know who Matthew actually is. And Matthew starts off his gospel without introducing himself. Matthew's actually introduced in the Gospel of Mark, the second chapter, verses 13 through 17. It's after Jesus has already called several of the disciples to himself at this point. But Jesus goes out in verse 13, and he goes beside the sea, and all the crowd was coming to him, and he was teaching them. And it says, as he passed by in verse 14, he saw Levi, this is Matthew, the son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax booth, and he said to him, "Follow me." And he rose and followed him. It continues, though. He doesn't just follow him. It says, and he reclined at a table in his house. So he calls Matthew to follow him, and then he immediately goes to his house, almost like Zacchaeus, but probably taller. And he reclined at the table in his house. Some of y'all didn't get that Bible school joke. Y'all need Bible hour, and it shows. I'm going to your house today. I'm going to your house today. I'm not going to sing. He sat and reclined at the table in his house, and many tax collectors and sinners were reclining there with Jesus and his disciples. In Luke's account in chapter 5, it actually gives the detail that Matthew doesn't just invite him over, like, I guess you can come, Jesus. He throws a feast. Well, that is important. What also is really important is the world that this interaction happens in, and that Matthew is going to be writing his genealogy and his gospel in. There's a term out there called Hellenism. Hellenism would be the culture and the ideology that people lived by in the climate or time that the Gospels were written. And we're going to study a lot of that as we study Matthew, because you can't understand what the Gospel authors are really trying to say unless you understand who they're trying to say it to and why it matters. But for our purposes this morning, I just want to let you guys know, open your Bibles here to the very first page of Matthew, and you're going to find this little sliver of a page, and it just says in really nice calligraphy script, the New Testament. And right on the very page before that, you've got Malachi chapter 4. It's one tiny white page between the testaments. But in real life, a lot of time has passed between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament. By the time Jesus arrives on the scene and Matthew is writing down the account, so much has changed in the world. Not only has the world changed, but Judaism has changed. And it's really important that we understand the context of the world that Matthew is writing in for this gospel. And I say a new gospel that Matthew is writing because there was this guy named Alexander. You guys familiar with Alexander? He goes by Alexander the Great, and they call him Alexander the Great because he basically, by the age of like 11 or something, conquered the entire known world and somehow kept it all at peace, told everyone to speak the same language, and everybody did. And it's really rather incredible what he accomplished, but he did it by proclaiming that Greek word for gospel, a euangelion. And it was the gospel of Greece, this new way of life. Alexander was different than rulers that came before because he conquered the world, but he did it in a way that had never been done before. He had an army and he used an army, but the way he kept the world under his control was not with his army. He did it with his culture. And his culture we call Hellenism. And this is the way of life that the gospel of Greece was proclaimed throughout the world. So when Matthew writes his gospel, a new gospel about a new king and a new kingdom, it's by no means the first gospel that ever existed. Alexander had a gospel, Caesar even had a gospel, but now Matthew comes to say this is something different. Matthew's gospel is actually a counter gospel about a new kind of king and a new kind of kingdom. Now, just a little bit about Hellenism because it's really important to our lives today, and I hope that you understand why by the time we're finished this morning. There's something strange about Hellenism. It was an idea or a way of life that for the first time in history took the gods, who were always the main characters of everyone's life, and it bumped the gods to the periphery and put mankind in the middle. The Greek philosophy was one that humans are the definition of everything that matters. The gods exist and they're powerful, but life is really defined by people. There's a famous Greek philosopher named Protagoras, not Pythagoras. A squared plus B squared equals C squared. We're back to school, baby mama. I know you're proud. But Protagoras said, man is the measure of all things. For the first time, life wasn't about the gods, it was about you. So, if that's not starting to sound familiar to what we experience on a daily basis, you see, the gods were still there, but if you know anything about Greek and Roman mythology, they're all like petulant, powerful, but they're more like humans than they are than than like the creator God is. They're angry, they're belligerent, they can be tricked, they make mistakes, they're not all that wise. Homie with wings flies too close to the sun, falls and dies. They had a lot of problems with the Greek gods. So there's all these mythologies where a Greek god would end up having a child with a human, and that person is a demigod who's the best of both worlds, Hercules and all those guys, and hence humans at the center of the world. Now, Alexander conquered the world, made everyone speak Greek, of which most of the New Testament was originally written in, and he essentially said, if you give me 4 things, I will control this world. He built cities everywhere he went, and in those cities, he established these 4 things. The first thing Alexander said he needed to control the world was education. They created this thing called the gymnasium. It's not the same gymnasium that we would have. It was a place of schooling in the Greek world. So he would build cities. You'll see later in the gospel accounts, there's this place called the Decapolis. That's a place where Jesus spent time with his disciples, was a group of 10 cities that were built there to spread Greek culture and Hellenism. He would put education first. He also said, if I control healthcare, hospital is a Greek concept. He said, if you give me education and you give me health care, I will control people. The third thing he said, if you give me entertainment and the theater. Do you remember we talked about the Greek agora? And we talked about how that was the center of culture and life and social life for the Greeks. So now we've got education, we've got health care, we've got entertainment. And then he said, give me athletics and the arena, because this culture is one built off competition and tribalism. And if you start to think about the world that Alexander created, and that these were the basis of Greek culture, and Alexander's saying, if I control these, I will control people because I control their deepest desires by those 4 things. I control their deepest fears by those 4 things. And by those 4 things, I can tug on any heartstring that can get them to move exactly the way I want them to move and to fall in the line the way I want them to fall into line. And if that doesn't sound a bit familiar, I want you to direct your attention to this quickly becoming nasty election cycle where the main 4 issues are what? Education, healthcare, entertainment and social issues, and athletics. Not usually on the front burner, but there have been weird times in American culture where, like, the commissioner of the NFL, Roger Goodell, is doing a full-blown deposition on Capitol Hill in front of the Congress, or they're trying to decide how we should negotiate NIL deals for college football players. And I'm thinking, what does that have to do with the Senate and the House of Representatives? Until I realized that sports aren't just sports, and not just because it's the South and we love football. Sports are an actual socio-political issue in a Hellenistic world. So just realize that what we are uncovering here today for this study is a world that is very much like the world that we live in today. We live in a Hellenistic world. When I say the Western world, I am speaking of this Hellenistic way of organizing culture that started with Alexander and is still in place today. As Christians, it's a real challenge to live faithfully in a Hellenistic world. And now, with all of that laid down, by the time Matthew was alive, or Jesus was alive, or the New Testament was happening, the Jews had been wrestling with this very problem. The question and the problem for Judaism at this time in history was, how do you live faithfully in this new world? How do you serve God in this world? A world that's inundated with pagan culture, that is bereft of our morals and our ethics, where we're culturally occupied by this Greek way of doing life, and they're physically occupied by Rome, and they are forced to comply with regulations that made them feel like they were sacrificing their beliefs and their morals. And there were heated disagreements about just how you were supposed to respond in this new world. The world of Matthew's world wasn't a unified Judaism. There were 5 at least major ways that the Jews decided we're going to try and deal with this, and they were all differing sects. So when we go through the study of Matthew, when we read about these different 5 groups, I want you to realize they have very bitter disagreements with one another, but they're all responding to the same problem. There were those Jews alive during the writing of this gospel that said, look, if you can't beat the Romans and the Greeks, just join them. That's basically what the Sadducees did. And there were those that said redemptive violence and terrorism is the only way that we can deal with this. There's a whole group of zealots. There are a couple of zealots that make their way into Jesus' party as disciples. And then there were those that said the best thing we can do is to buy a bunch of air-dried food in vacuum packs, go out into the desert, bury ourselves behind a vault door, and wait for God to come and judge everybody. They didn't really have the vacuum packs, but they're called the Essenes, and they did some really cool things to preserve the scripture that we now have today. They basically were spiritual doomsday preppers. Let me get away from all of this altogether. And then there were those who taught that the way that we respond to this is by absolute adherence to the Torah and the Bible. We will obey our way out of this situation. And those of you who aren't obeying are the reason that God will not save us from this occupation. Those would be the Pharisees. And then there were even those who just thought they could kind of have both. We actually kind of like the arena, and we kind of love the theater, but we kind of want God too. So we're going to do this thing where we have a little bit of everything. And those were called Herodians. And Herodians are a lot like you and I, because there is Cowboys football today. And y'all are going to be rushing back to see just how it's going to look. And it matters a lot to you whether you extend CD, doesn't it? Yeah. Not as much as God matters to you, though. What I want you to see is that none of those sects agreed with each other. They were all together desperately trying to figure out what they were supposed to do in response to this world. And so if you don't believe what Galatians 4:4 says, that Christ came at just the right time, and you think that just the right time is only because everyone spoke the same language and everyone had roads that they could access each other, you're missing the broader cultural climate in Judea at that time, complete with its social and political tensions that mirror our own time. Christians are also living in a Hellenistic world. And this Greek world that we're exploring together for these next weeks, and its pressures and its division, God considered the perfect soil for a new gospel, a gospel of a new king and a new kingdom. And our world, with its tensions and its divisions, are still the perfect soil for a new gospel and a new king and a new kind of kingdom. And so all these responses that we sink our teeth into in more detail in the weeks to come, all together, the Sadducees and Pharisees, the Essenes, the Zealots, the Herodians, all of them, different responses to the same problem. And they all have their own merits and their own problems and their own weaknesses. And you might be thinking, what does any of that have to do with Matthew? Because you claimed that he wrote the worst Jewish genealogy ever. Well, let's talk about that now that we know what's going on. Matthew actually is even worse than any of the responses that the people of Judea had embodied in their response to the ubiquities and problems of Hellenism and the occupation of Rome. Because all of those different groups had things they were right about and then things that they were severely wrong about. And Jesus will critique them all and call them all to a greater truth, rightfully so. But Matthew was a guy that didn't just have a conflicting ideology about how to respond and deal with this messy world. Matthew, the author of this gospel, wasn't even a flawed but respectable kind of person making an attempt to be faithful given the circumstances. Matthew actually didn't do anything that could have garnered sympathies and respect from his countrymen. Because to his countrymen, he was worse than one of the other factions that they were aware of. Because Matthew wasn't a Pharisee, a Sadducee, a Herodian, a Essene. He wasn't any of those things. Matthew was Uncle Sam. Matthew was the IRS. Matthew was a tax collector. And the problem with being a tax collector is that means now you're not even on my side. You work for the other guys. This is hard for us to imagine and understand because America has never been occupied. But just bear with me. Let's say that it was. Who would be the worst country to be occupied by? France. That would be really weird. France. Can't think of a culture that we might conflict with a little bit more. We're occupied by France, and Matthew has left his Jewishness behind, and now he's taxing you for badly baked baguettes at the gate of the market every day. You would hate Matthew. He's worse than someone who was just a little bit confused about how to respond. He abdicated his identity as a Jew. He left behind his loyalty to a nation. He actually walked away from everything that would have identified himself with his people and joined the other side. He became an errand boy for the oppressors. He was Benedict Arnold before Benedict Arnold. And as Jews, we're all trying to figure out how to live in this Greco-Roman disease. Matthew just straight joined them. And you got to ask, why? Matthew, how could you do this? What you can know is that it would have caused such disdain and disrepute. It would have absolutely left Matthew relationally to his family and his friends and his people on the outside looking in. And the question that I have that we won't know until someday in the kingdom is, how did that happen? What happened in Matthew's life that led him there? I would submit to you that something happened so traumatic in Levi's life that he decided the only thing left for him to do was just give it all up. He cashed out his Jewishness and he joined the enemy side. Imagine how his life would have changed, how it would have been perceived and hated, the animosity he would have felt from his own people. And here's the kicker. I know deep down that Matthew didn't want to do what he chose to do. And the reason I know is because when Jesus comes trotting by, he's willing to give it up and follow him and throw a feast at the drop of a hat. He didn't really want to be where he was. That's why he was able to follow Jesus. And now he's writing us this story so we can know that Matthew, through some events in his life, had found himself on the outside looking in. He was a true outcast. And here's the point that we need to get about the Gospel of Matthew. The person writing this gospel, of all people, he is the last person for whom the kingdom of God was supposed to be for. As a Jew, looking for a Jewish Messiah, looking for the king and the kingdom, he's the last one that is supposed to be welcome in this place. And that is the blinking clue. It's the signal for what Matthew is going to make the theme and the point of his entire gospel. Yes, as you've heard and maybe learned in class like I did, it is a gospel written to the Jews. Yes, it is a gospel that portrays Jesus as the Jewish Messiah, but that is not all. This is not a story of how we just prove that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. What we're going to see as we study this gospel is that Matthew has something else that he needs to accomplish. And it will speak to every single one of us right here and right now in a multitude of ways. Now, back to this really, really bad genealogy. Jacob, I know you didn't think I made you do that for nothing, and we weren't actually going to talk about the genealogy. Let's talk about the genealogy, okay? We've already said that Matthew is a Jew writing a Jewish gospel about a Jewish Messiah to a Jewish people. And as long as I've studied Matthew from the time I was a kid all the way through college and then postgraduate theological schooling, it's been said that the point of the gospel was just to prove that Jesus was the Jewish Messiah. And I don't want you to get twisted what I'm saying this morning or what I will say in the rest of this study. I do believe and know that one aspect that Matthew is trying to get across is that certainly Jesus is the promised Jewish Messiah. But I do not think that's the only point. And frankly, as we wrestle with this, I will ask so that we can tug at it if that's the main point of what Matthew is trying to do. Do you remember when we studied Genesis? I said that we could gain something from asking difficult questions of the text. And that where there are really difficult questions, God is always faithful to provide a really incredible answer. And those answers will always come not from me, not from some outside source, but actually from the text. I want to call us back to that way of thinking as we look at this genealogy and embrace some really tough questions we might have been afraid to ask before, or honestly, just never considered before, because Matthew as a Jew is thinking like a Jew, writing like a Jew, to Jews about a Jew, okay? And he's got little treasures hidden underneath. That's all well and good. And he kicks off his gospel in the worst way of all time. Listen, if your goal is to establish Jesus as the Jewish Messiah to some Jews for whom genealogies mean so much and it's their be-all and end-all, this is a bold move, Cotton. How bad is it? Let's take a look at it. Let's read real quick one more time. Let's see. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. This is perfect. But things will go off the rail immediately after that, because he goes on to say, Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah, his brothers, and Judah the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar, and Perez the father of Hezron. Hold on just a second. You remember when we talked about Abraham and the genealogy, what made Abraham's genealogy so strange for the time in a patriarchal culture and society? Was that you didn't mention matriarchal details or women in a genealogy unless you absolutely had to. And one of the things that led us to a deeper understanding of what Genesis was teaching us about the character of Abraham was that we had these women listed in the genealogy. Now, I'm going to say we would have lots of modern critiques for the way that patriarchal society was structured and leaving women out and all of those things, and that is true, but this is the culture that we're still living in right now. You would never include women unless you absolutely had to. And so when there is a woman included, we know that there's something deeper that it's trying to communicate to us. Now, it's interesting here that Tamar is the first one that comes up. I just want to ask you, do you know the story of Tamar? Some of y'all? Like, I'm really not free to discuss all of the details here because it's babies in the room today. Tamar's story is one that does not need to be included here. She's absolutely unnecessary to the genealogy. Judah is the father of Perez. Next, we could be done. And if the part or the point of a Jewish genealogy is to prove my pedigree, to prove the purity of my line, Matthew is purposely, and don't miss this, he is purposely including her, going out of his way to put Tamar as the name of the mother here. And if you remember that story between Tamar and Judah, it's a scandalous story. It's a story that involves illicit activities and prostitution and Judah not fulfilling his duties and incestuous relationships and men taking advantage of women. It is a dark story. Why, Matthew, would you not just include a woman here to prove a patriarchal lineage? Why would you include this one? Isn't it shameful to have a story like that? To have that in your history? Let's give Matthew the benefit of the doubt, and maybe he had a moment under the inspiration of the Spirit where he forgot what a Jewish genealogy was supposed to be. But we quickly keep reading and right down there in verse 5, Salmon the father of Boaz, by Rahab, another addition of another woman that's not necessary for the genealogy to continue, and another woman with a certain type of story that's a little bit of a double whammy because this is a prostitute and a Canaanite. This inclusion is not helping us prove Jesus' Jewish lineage or pedigree. Why is Matthew going out of his way to mention a lady who is not a Jew, that doesn't even need to be mentioned, and yet a story that we kind of don't really want to bring up? Then we have Ruth, and we love Ruth in the very same verse because we know who Ruth was, and she's at a hinge point in the Bible where God does incredible things. But what you can't remember is that Ruth was a Moabite. Moab was called the wash bin of the world by God in the Old Testament. You know, Moabites couldn't be mentioned for 10 generations in the Jewish lineage. Why would you want to bring up a Moabite of all things? If I'm doing a Jewish genealogy, Tamar and Rahab and Ruth are the least likely suspects that I want to call up for consideration. And just if you think that he's just being gracious and generous and he's missed the point of what a Jewish genealogy is supposed to be, a little bit further down, we see this inclusion, David, the father of Solomon, by the wife of Uriah. Who was the wife of Uriah? Bathsheba, also famous, or I should say infamous, one of the most infamous accounts in the entire biblical record, one that included not just infidelity, but murder, entrapment, and political misgivings that set the whole nation on edge. What do we have going on here? How does this help? What is Matthew doing in this Jewish genealogy? And before you say, hey, this is just Matthew's way of saying that women are important. Well, yes, but not just that. Don't let anybody tell you that the Bible's not pro-women. It absolutely is pro-woman. But there's a reason why. Look, Matthew is doing this on purpose. He is intentionally going throughout the genealogy, and he is pointing out women in the story that we would typically like to push out or avoid. And he is including these dark stories. Ladies, if you grew up in this tradition in the Church of Christ or any other probably pretty conservative evangelical group, y'all got that book y'all love to do in ladies' Bible studies. You know the one, the girl wearing the veil with the jewels, and it says something in like italics, bad girls of the Bible. Yeah, y'all know that book. I don't mean to make y'all mad today, but y'all didn't come up with that. Matthew did it a long time ago. He wrote the original bad girls of the Bible. But why? Don't miss this. Matthew's going out of his way to say that these dark stories in the history and genealogy of Jesus' family are part of God's story too. He's announcing a new king and a new kingdom. And the point is that the people that we would leave out of the story, the people we would want to not include, God refuses to leave out. The people that we think make the story less impressive or less valid, God is not going to leave on the outside looking in. And Matthew's agenda or mindset or theme and purpose comes out in his own story. And this is where the genealogy and the Jewish tension with the Hellenistic world come together to form this new gospel, the story that Matthew is trying to tell. I want you to realize before we study any more of this gospel that Matthew has an intentional purpose for telling his stories this way. And Matthew's main theme comes straight out of his own story and experience. Because the Matthew that we talked about a few minutes ago, the Matthew that we explored a little bit of his background, that Matthew knew what it was like to be on the outside looking in. Matthew, as a tax collector, means at some point that Matthew cashed in his chips as a Jew. I don't know how it happened. I don't know why it happened. But something happened in Matthew's life where he said, you know what? I don't think there's anything left for me in this Jew thing anymore. I don't think I have any other role to play or piece to play in this story. So I might as well just go work for the Romans. And he became hated by his countrymen as a tax collector. Matthew sold his soul to Rome, is what we would have said. My call in the Jewish narrative is done. My part of being a Hebrew is over. But then Matthew's story is also that along came Jesus one day walking on the beach, and he looked at this guy sitting in his tax collector booth. And this is the part that's crazy to me, because he's not the first disciple that Jesus has called. That means we already have Peter, Andrew, James, and John, Galileans who have to pay taxes to Rome. Jesus shows up on the beach with 4 dudes that Matthew has taxed and says, follow me. Can you imagine? Do you know who James and John were when they first started following Jesus? It's the same guys that would say, Lord, can we call fire down and smite this village? And Jesus is bringing a traitor into the fold. Someone who the kingdom is not supposed to be for. Jesus says, follow me. And it makes perfect sense that when Matthew goes to write his gospel, his point is, I got an announcement about a new kind of king and a new kind of kingdom. And in this kingdom, under this king, it is open and available to anybody who wants to participate in what God is doing in the world. Matthew's message is that I don't care where you came from. I don't care what you did. I don't care what mistakes you made. I don't care what they said. I don't care who hates you. I don't care if you hate you. In the kingdom of heaven, under King Jesus, you will never be left on the outside looking in. I'm going to spoil this for you, church, because you're going to see that almost every time we turn this page in this gospel, we're going to find stories of all the people that aren't supposed to belong, finding belonging. You're going to find people who shouldn't have any faith, and Jesus responding to them saying, I haven't seen faith like this in all of Israel. And every time Jesus walks into a place where they have the Bible, the Old Testament scriptures, and their life is built around synagogue and being obedient, Jesus is going to say to them, in all the faith that they show, that's not the faith that God is looking for. He's going to say to them, you don't have the faith necessary for me to work miracles here. You're going to see this happen again and again and again. Everything in the Gospel of Matthew is going to be backwards. It's going to be inside out. It's going to be upside down. The people that are supposed to have it don't have it. And the people that aren't supposed to have it, Jesus says, they're in. This is Matthew's announcement of King Jesus and his new kingdom, a kingdom where there are no outsiders and no one's left on the outside looking in. It makes all the sense in the world because Matthew writes to a religious people. He writes to a people that think they've got it all figured out. And Matthew's warning to them is, you are missing it and you're going to miss the kingdom of God. And I pull no punches and make no mistake in telling you this will be a great study for us, but it is the most confrontational gospel out of the 4 for his audience and for us. Because every time we turn this page, he's going to say, God's kingdom is different than you think it is. It is made up of people that are different than you think it is. And I know this because I got a second chance with Jesus. It's not supposed to be for me, but he called me. Family, this is the gospel that Matthew proclaims that the world desperately needed then and our world desperately needs now. This is the gospel that we need to hear. We live in a world that thinks they understand Christianity and the kingdom. And you can just take a look at your news today and realize that people are sorely mistaken. We live in a world where we think we've got it all figured out. But Matthew says, you're in danger. Matthew will not let us miss that all those people we aren't supposed to care about, that aren't supposed to be in, are in. You think they're out, but they're in. And your mission, church, is to go bring them in and give them a place to belong. You know, there are so many people in this world, even in this room, who know exactly what this feels like. They have made decisions in their lives. Inexplicable things have happened to them that made them feel like they don't belong anywhere. Like they're people who just desperately want to belong, but they feel like the people they want to belong to and what they want to be a part of are actually better off without them. And because of the social pressure and the brokenness, even the best of us sometimes feel like we ought to just give up. And there are people around you, maybe even in the pew beside you, who are this close from just cashing their chips in and saying, this Jesus thing, I don't think it's for me anymore. Maybe it never was. Maybe it was never mine. Maybe it's not for me. Maybe I'm on the outside looking in. You've heard people say that. That church thing's just not for me. Here's what I want you to know about that person. They don't think it's for them, but deep down they want it to be. Because Matthew cashed in his chips, but he was ready for Jesus to walk by and say something different to him. He was ready for someone to come and say, yes, you do belong. He was ready for someone to come and say, yes, you belong here. There are people like Matthew everywhere, outsiders that have given up, but deep down, they're waiting for someone to walk by their tax booth and look at them in their shame and not define them by their shame. Someone to not care what the people around them think or say about them. Someone who will say what Jesus said to Matthew, that your part in the story is not over, that you have a purpose, you have a value, you are welcome, you have a place, you are loved, you belong. Are you that person? Church, do you know that person? Because this is a new gospel about a new king and a new kingdom where you don't stand on the outside looking in anymore. This is the gospel of King Jesus. And if you are subject to it this morning, you are most welcome to join us in this new kingdom. If we can serve you in any way, please come.